All right, hello, welcome back, everybody. PayPal and Patreon are down below if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. So it's time for the monthly oil demand levels update, starting with the largest consumer, still obviously and effectively at this point going to remain the US, averaging about 20 million barrels per day for the last 2 decades or so, and coming in right within line this time at 19.6. China seeming like they might be leveling off between 17 and 18. We'll need a few more years to see, although in the economic blowback from their upcoming invasion attempt of Taiwan, their consumption would drop pretty substantially anyways. But for the time being, for the last few years, they've started to level off, it seems, between 17 and 18, as their economy has been stagnant ever since 2020, basically, and also their population is aging rapidly. And the older people get, the less stuff they do, less places they go to work less, obviously, buy less stuff. So China this time came in again a bit under 17, just right underneath it. India, meanwhile, has been climbing up towards 6, recently set a new demand record up at 5.88. This time they dropped down a bit from that, most recently at 5.49 million barrels per day. Japan used to be up at 6 decades ago, but as they adopted mass public transit, fuel efficiency massively improved, and their population has aged rapidly, they have declined down to averaging more between 3.5 and 4, this time coming in at 3.61. Russia once had a demand level of around 5 back in the USSR times, not the USSR as a whole, but just Russia within the USSR. They collapsed when the USSR collapsed, and as their economy recovered over the last few decades, their demand levels got back close up to 4. But then, in the economic fallout from invading Ukraine, their demand levels crashed down to as low as 2.7. However, they have since then climbed back up a bit of the way, up to usually being a bit above 3, this time coming in at 3.2. South Korea has leveled off over the last number of years, decade or more, and they've leveled off in the upper 2s, and they'll probably be tipping down the same as Japan. And this time they came in at 2.93 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia fluctuating between 2 and 3 over the course of any given year, as during the summer their demand is much higher because it's a lot hotter, and thus their electricity demand, a decent portion of which is from oil-fired power plants, is much higher in the summer. But it's the winter months now, and their latest data is from, I believe, December, at which point they were down to 2.39 million barrels per day. Canada, for the last long while, similar to the US, down to the south of it, has been relatively at the same level. In Canada's case, it's been averaging about 2.5, and this time came in right within the zone at 2.44. Brazil was close up to 3 in the early 2010s, but their economy kind of stagnated and fell apart, so their demand contracted down to the lower 2s instead. And they were kind of recovering recently, but over the last year or so, they've more contracted back down closer to 2 again. And this time, actually, most likely because of a lot of the stuff down the south of the country being cut off and shut down because of all the flooding recently, they've dropped below 2 for the first time in a while, coming down to only 1.8 million barrels per day of oil demand. Indonesia has moved up to Germany's place now starting to average higher than them, at usually being a bit above 2, and this time coming in at 2.33 million barrels per day. Germany had once been up at 3, but they've declined over the last few decades down closer to 2, this time coming in at 2.13 million. Iran is up to usually a bit below 2 million as their domestic consumption levels. This time, this time most recently coming in at just under 1.8. Mexico was once up at 2. However, post-COVID recovery, they've never actually returned to their prior oil demand levels and have only been a bit above 1.5, this time coming in actually right at 1.5 million barrels per day. France was at 1.6 before COVID, and post-COVID recovery, they have still mostly averaged around 1.6, and this time they came in a bit down though at 1.44. The UK, on the other hand, was at 1.6 pre-COVID, and post-COVID they've settled into averaging just a bit lower at around 1.5 instead, this time coming in close enough at 1.47. Thailand was up at about 1.3 or 1.4 pre-COVID, and post-recovery, they've not entirely returned to their prior levels, though they got close. It looks like they're going to be leveling off from here around 1.2 or a bit above, this time coming in at 1.18. Turkey has gotten up to averaging around 1.2 in present day and is still growing, this time coming in at 1.13. Italy was once up around 2, but is down to averaging more around 1.3, this time coming in at 1.34. Spain was climbing up towards 2, but when their economy kind of fell apart a decade or two ago, they declined down to around 1.3 and have stuck around there ever since, this time coming in at 1.29. The island city-state of Singapore peaked up at around 1.4 and has since declined down to a demand level more around 1.2 and heading lower towards 1.1. This time they came in with a jump upwards at 1.39. The UAE is close to averaging 1.2 million barrels per day for its domestic oil demand, which is why they want to up their production plateau to 4 million barrels per day instead of 3, so they can re-expand their export ratio. This time they came in with a demand level of 1.17 domestically. Australia is around 1.1, climbing up slowly to 1.2, and this time they came in right at 1.1. The Nederland, for the last few years had been averaging about 1 million, but now they've been dropping down towards averaging closer to 900, this time coming in at 911,000. Taiwan had been averaging around a million for about 2 decades, but now they've also been averaging more around 900,000 instead. This time they are at 850. Iraq has not been releasing exact data, so I've had to rely on backwards math, and thus I only have the loose range this time, but most recently their demand level came in somewhere between 700 and 750,000. Malaysia is also usually around 800. This time they came in at 717. Polska is usually around 800 now. They came in somewhat down as well at 681. Egypt is also usually in the 800s, and they came in at the start of the year at 851. Argentina is usually around 700 or so in present day when they're not in the middle of an economic collapse, and this time they came in at 718. Belgium used to be around 700, but over the last few years they've gone down to averaging closer to 600, this time coming in at 622. South Africa's consumption has swung wildly up and down over the last number of years as the country has teetered on the edge of falling apart. This time they had an upswing in terms of domestic consumption back up to 601,000 barrels per day. Colombia, over in South America, has grown up to averaging close to 500,000 in present day, and this time set a new demand record, with their latest numbers coming in as a new all-time high of 555,000 barrels per day. Nigeria in present day had gotten up to around 600, but they've been consistently lower for the last year and a half as the country has, kind of similar to South Africa, been on the edge of economically falling apart. And most recently, it looks like they came in around 515. The Philippines has gotten up to averaging around 500,000. They have not released data for several months, though. Last time they were at 513. Algeria is almost up to averaging 500,000 and just set a new record high at 486,000. Kazakhstan came in at exactly 500,000 barrels per day of domestic oil consumption. Chile is usually around 400 in present day, and this is probably where they're going to level off. And this time they came in at 384. Morocco is now averaging above 300,000, and this time came in at 290, but just before that, a couple months ago, they set a new record all-time high of 356,000. Sweden in present day is usually around 300. This time they came in at 251. Greece has declined down to usually being around 300, and this time they came in at 287. Venezuela, once up at 800, declines down to only around 200 after they collapsed in the later 2010s, but their domestic demand has recovered over the last few years up to around 300. This time, though, they had a sudden plunge down to only a demand level of 193. Peru is usually up around 300, and they have still not released any recent data for the last few months. Last time they were at 283. Ecuador is up to averaging about 300 in present day, and they most recently came in at 317,000. Romania is usually around 250, and they came in at 237. Portugal, despite only having half the population of Romania, is also usually at 250, and they came in at 205. Then there's the 200 Club, a list of mostly European, but a few other countries who average right around 200, starting with Austria, who this time came in at 225,000. The Czech Republic, who this time came in at 201. Hungary, this time came in a bit down at 168. Switzerland, who came in a bit under 200 at 193. Finland, or Suomi, who came in recently down at 145. Norway, who came in right on point at 212. Libya, who came in decently up, their highest domestic consumption level since 2012, 2013, right after the Civil War first started, at 250. And Oman, who is usually up to 200 in present day, but they came in a bit, but they came in down 25% this time, it looks like, at 150. All right, that's it for this one. So thank you everybody for sticking around and listening. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe if you haven't already. PayPal and Patreon are down there if you want to support me. Only do so if you actually can. There's also a link in the description to a Google Drive that has these graphs and all kinds of other graphs covering all kinds of different things. All of that's free to access 24/7, free to use. There's a link to my photography Instagram as well, and one in the top pinned comment to my cat's YouTube channel. May God bless and protect all of you, and I will see you all around next time.